The diplomatic vessel Harmony's crown moved through space like a silver fish swimming through an ocean of stars. Inside, Hajin stood at the window of his small quarters, watching distant galaxies spin slowly in the void. He had been doing this every morning for the past 3 months, finding peace in the silence of space. Hajin was not like the other diplomats on the ship. While they filled every room with constant chatter and debate, he preferred to listen. His colleagues found this strange. In the Galactic Coalition, where 73 different species met to discuss everything from trade routes to territorial disputes, silence was considered rude. Everyone was expected to speak, to contribute, to fill every moment with words. But Hajin was human, and humans understood something that other species seemed to have forgotten. Sometimes the best way to understand someone was not to speak, but to listen with your whole being. The door chimed softly. Hajin turned from the window as it slid open, revealing Ambassador Tarn. The Vorsan had crystalline features that caught the light and split it into rainbows across the walls. His expression, as always, was difficult to read. "You have a new assignment," Tarn said, his voice like wind chimes. "You will work with Ambassador Velrin of Thesara on the Krovan trade negotiations." Hajin nodded. He had heard of Velrin. The Thalen people were known throughout the coalition for their beauty and their diplomatic skill. They came from a water world and had smooth, flowing movements that reminded everyone of ocean waves. Their skin could change colors based on their emotions, making them terrible at hiding their feelings but excellent at honest communication. "The Krovan are difficult," Tarn continued. "They dominate every conversation. They use loud voices and aggressive tactics. Ambassador Velrin requested human assistance. She specifically asked for someone who understands different approaches." Hajin understood what Tarn was not saying. The coalition thought humans were strange. After joining the galactic community only 50 years ago, humans had proven to be competent diplomats, but their methods confused everyone. They asked fewer questions. They spoke less. They seemed content to simply observe. "When do I meet her?" Hajin asked. "In 1 hour. Conference room 7. Tarn paused at the door. "Hajin, the Krovan negotiations have been failing for 2 years. This is important, please. Try to be more engaged this time." After Tarn left, Hajin returned to the window. He knew what Tarn meant. His superiors thought he was too quiet, too passive. They did not understand that his silence was not weakness or disinterest. It was attention. It was respect. An hour later, Hajin entered Conference Room 7. The space was designed to accommodate multiple species, with adjustable gravity zones and customizable atmosphere controls. Currently, it was set to standard coalition environment, comfortable for most beings. Velrin was already there, standing near the large view screen that displayed charts and data about the Krovan Empire. Hajin stopped in the doorway, simply looking at her for a moment. She was beautiful. Her skin was currently a soft shade of blue-green, like shallow tropical waters. Her movements were graceful and fluid as she reviewed the information on the screen. When she sensed his presence and turned, her eyes were a deep violet that seemed to hold entire oceans of thought. "You must be Hajin," she said. Her voice was musical, with harmonics that made each word sound like several notes played at once. "Thank you for agreeing to help." Hajin bowed slightly, a human gesture of respect. He did not speak immediately, taking a moment to really see her. He noticed the way her colors shifted slightly toward a warmer green, indicating curiosity or perhaps nervousness. He noticed how she held herself with confidence despite the obvious stress lines around her eyes. "I am honored to work with you, Ambassador," he finally said. Velrin's colors flickered briefly to yellow surprise. Most diplomats would have immediately started discussing strategy or asking questions about the negotiations. This human simply stood there, calm and present. "The Krovan arrive in 2 hours," she said, gesturing to the view screen. "They want to establish exclusive trade rights through Thalan space. Our government cannot agree to their terms, but they refuse to negotiate." Every meeting becomes louder and more aggressive. I am not sure how to proceed." Hajin moved to the view screen and studied the information. He read through the previous negotiation transcripts, noting the pattern. The Krovan would make extreme demands. The Thalan diplomats would explain why those demands were impossible. The Krovan would raise their voices and make the same demands again. Round and round for 2 years. "What is your role in these negotiations?" Velrin asked. "Will you speak for humanity? Offer new proposals?" Hajin turned from the screen and looked at her directly. His brown eyes were steady, calm. When he spoke, his voice was quiet but clear. "I will watch and listen," he said. "Sometimes that is enough." Velrin's colors shifted through several shades, confusion mixing with frustration. What kind of diplomat only watches and listens? What good was he if he did not argue or debate? But before she could express these thoughts, the door chimed. The Krovan had arrived early. 3 massive beings entered the room. The Krovan were built like living mountains, with thick gray skin and eyes that glowed red. They wore ceremonial armor that clanked with each heavy step. The leader, General Cross, surveyed the room with obvious disdain. "Ambassador Velrin," Cross said, his voice like grinding stones. "I see you have brought someone else. Does the great Thalen Empire finally admit it cannot negotiate without help?" Velrin's skin flashed orange, anger, but she controlled it quickly. Professional training helped her maintain composure even when her emotions showed on her skin for all to see. "This is Hajin, a human diplomat. He is here to observe and provide counsel." Cross looked at Hajin and his red eyes narrowed. Humans were small compared to Krovan, fragile. Cross had expected someone impressive, someone who might intimidate or impress. Instead, he saw a quiet man who simply stood there, meeting his gaze without fear, but also without challenge. "A human," Cross sneered. "I have heard of your species. You talk very little, perhaps because you have little to say." He laughed, a sound like rocks tumbling down a mountain. His companions joined in. Hajin said nothing. He did not look away, but he did not rise to the bait either. He simply acknowledged Cross with a slight nod and moved to sit at the conference table. His calm was absolute. The negotiations began exactly as the transcripts had predicted. Cross made his demands. Velrin explained why they were impossible. Cross raised his voice and repeated the demands. His companions pounded the table for emphasis. The room filled with noise and aggression. Through it all, Hajin sat quietly. He did not interrupt. He did not add his voice to the chaos. But he watched everything. He watched how Cross's eyes would flick to his companions before making each demand, seeking approval. He watched how Velrin's colors shifted rapidly between orange anger and blue-green anxiety. He watched the smallest companion, Krovan, who seemed uncomfortable with his general's aggressive tactics. Most importantly, whenever Velrin glanced his way, seeking support or guidance, Hajin met her eyes. He did not smile or nod or give her any obvious signal. He simply held her gaze for a moment, steady and calm, before returning his attention to the others. And somehow, in those brief moments of eye contact, Velrin felt something shift inside her. The human's quiet presence felt like an anchor in a storm. His silence felt like strength rather than absence. When she returned to the negotiation, her voice was steadier. The meeting ended with no progress, as expected. Cross and his companions left with loud promises to return tomorrow. When the door closed behind them, Velrin collapsed into a chair, her skin cycling through exhausted shades of gray and dull blue. "That was a disaster," she said. "Nothing changed. Nothing ever changes with them. I do not understand what you were supposed to accomplish by just sitting there." Her frustration was clear, and it was directed at him. Hajin understood. From her perspective, he had done nothing. He had not spoken a single word during the entire negotiation. How could that possibly help? But Hajin had noticed something that Velrin, caught in the storm of aggressive voices, had not. The smallest Krovan had watched Hajin throughout the meeting. And near the end, that Krovan had briefly touched General Cross's arm, a gesture that seemed to calm the general slightly. Silence, Hajin knew, was not the absence of action. Sometimes it was the most powerful action possible, but he could not explain this to Velrin, not yet. She would need to discover it for herself. "I am sorry I disappointed you," he said quietly. "Tomorrow will be different." Velrin looked at him with her violet eyes, trying to understand this strange human who seemed so calm in the face of her frustration. Before she could respond, he bowed slightly and left the conference room. She sat alone, watching the stars outside the viewport, wondering what tomorrow would bring. Her skin slowly shifted back to her natural blue-green, and she found herself thinking about the human's eyes. There had been something in his gaze during those brief moments of contact. Not emptiness, not absence. Something deeper. Something she could not quite name but had never encountered before in all her years of diplomacy. Velrin could not sleep. She lay in her quarters with the lights dimmed to simulate the deep ocean darkness of her home world, but her mind would not rest. The meeting with the Crovan played over and over in her thoughts, but it was not General Cross's aggressive demands that kept her awake. It was the human. Hajin had sat through the entire negotiation without speaking a single word. In any other circumstance, with any other diplomat from any other species, this would have been seen as failure. The coalition valued participation, engagement, the active exchange of ideas. Silence was considered lazy at best, insulting at worst, but something about Hajin's silence had felt different. Velrin's skin shifted through shades of confused purple as she thought about it. His silence had not felt empty. When their eyes met across the table, when she looked to him for support during Cross's verbal attacks, she had felt something pass between them. Not words, not even gestures, just presence. Finally, unable to bear her own thoughts any longer, Velrin rose and dressed. The ship operated on a 26-hour cycle to accommodate multiple species' biological needs, and it was currently in the quiet hours when most beings rested. She made her way through empty corridors to the observation deck. The observation deck was the largest open space on the Harmony's crown, a wide room with floor-to-ceiling windows that looked out into the void. Stars stretched in all directions, and distant nebulae painted clouds of color across the darkness. Velrin often came here when she needed to think, finding something calming about the infinite expanse. She was surprised to find she was not alone. Hajin stood at the far window, his silhouette dark against the starlight. He did not turn when she entered, but somehow she knew he was aware of her presence. For a moment, she considered leaving. This felt like an intrusion, walking in on someone's private moment. But then he spoke. "The stars look different from every world," he said quietly. "From Earth, we see familiar patterns, constellations we named thousands of years ago. From Thesara, I imagine you see completely different arrangements." Velrin moved closer, standing a few paces away from him. Her skin shifted to a softer blue-green, less agitated than before. "Yes," she said. "On Thesara, we have the Great Tide, a cluster of stars that marks the beginning of our storm season. Every child learns to recognize it. But here in deep space, I cannot find it. Everything is different." They stood in silence for a while, both looking out at the void. Normally, this would have made Velrin uncomfortable. Coalition diplomats were trained to fill silences, to keep conversations flowing, to never let awkward gaps develop. But with Hajin, the silence did not feel awkward. It felt natural, like breathing. Still, her frustration from earlier returned. She needed to understand. "Why did you say nothing today?" she asked, her voice carrying a sharp edge. "The Crovan walked all over us. They insulted you directly, insulted me, insulted my entire world. And you just sat there. How is that helpful?" Hajin turned to face her now. In the dim light of the observation deck, his features were soft, thoughtful. He did not look offended by her directness. "If I had spoken," he said slowly, "what would have changed? Cross would have added my voice to the noise, turned my words into another thing to shout down. The room was already full of sound. It needed something else. What? What did it need?" Her color shifted toward frustrated orange again. "Space," Hajin said simply. "Room to breathe. A place where something other than anger could exist." Velrin wanted to argue, but the words caught in her throat. She thought about the meeting again, seeing it differently now. Yes, the room had been full of noise and aggression, but there had been one calm point, one place of stillness in the storm. Hajin. And when she had looked at him, even briefly, she had found her own center again. She began to pace, her movements quick and sharp. The Thalen grace was still there, but her agitation showed in every gesture. Hajin simply watched her, his expression open and attentive. "I have been a diplomat for 15 years, she said. "I have negotiated trade agreements, peace treaties, cultural exchanges. I am good at my job. But these Crovan, they make me feel helpless. Like nothing I say matters. Like I am just noise to them. Background sound they can ignore." She stopped pacing and turned to face him fully. Her skin shifted through several colors rapidly, emotions fighting for dominance, and then, without planning to, without thinking, she asked the question that had been building inside her since the moment she first saw him. "Do you think I am beautiful?" The words hung in the air between them. Velrin's skin flashed white with shock at her own question. Where had that come from? That was not what she meant to ask. That was not appropriate. In Thalen culture, questions about beauty were intimate, reserved for close friends or romantic partners. And yet the question had emerged from somewhere deep inside her. From a place of vulnerability she had not known existed. She wanted to take it back, to apologize, to explain that she did not mean it the way it sounded. But before she could speak, she looked at Hajin and saw his reaction. He had gone very still. His eyes were fixed on her, and in them she saw something she had never seen in another being's eyes before. Not just looking, but truly seeing. Not evaluating or judging, but witnessing. His gaze traveled across her changing colors, her violet eyes, the graceful lines of her form, and there was no calculation in it. Only appreciation. Only wonder. The seconds stretched. In coalition culture, not answering a direct question immediately was considered rude. You were expected to respond, to fill the space, to keep the conversation moving. But Hajin simply stood there looking at her. And the longer he stayed silent, the more Velrin realized that his silence was not rude at all. His eyes softened. The corners of his mouth curved up slightly. Not quite a smile, but something close to it. His whole body seemed to relax, as if standing before her was the most natural thing in the universe. He did not look away from her shifting colors, but seemed to drink them in, watching each new shade appear and fade like watching waves on an endless ocean. Velrin's skin began to shift. The whites of shock faded. The orange of frustration disappeared. The confused purples melted away, and slowly, like a sunrise, her colors settled into a warm golden amber. It was the Thalen shade of deep contentment, of profound happiness, of being truly seen and accepted. She had not shown this color in years, and then she understood. His silence was not absence. His silence was fullness. It was not that he had nothing to say. It was that what he felt could not be reduced to words. Any words he spoke would diminish what his silence expressed. In that moment of quiet, he had told her more than any speech could contain. A smile spread across her face, genuine and warm. She felt tears forming in her eyes, though she did not know why. Nothing sad had happened, nothing frightening, but somehow in this human silence she had experienced something profound, something that touched a part of her she did not know was hungry to be touched. "Silence is an answer," she said softly. Hajin's smile grew slightly larger. He nodded just once, a small movement that said, "Yes, you understand." They stood together in the observation deck, surrounded by infinite space and infinite stars. The silence between them was no longer uncomfortable or confusing. It was a language they both suddenly spoke, a way of being together that required no words. After a long time, Velrin spoke again, her voice barely above a whisper. "I have spent my whole life learning to speak," she said. "Learning languages, diplomatic protocols, negotiation techniques. I thought communication was about words, about expressing ideas clearly and persuasively. But you have shown me something I never learned in all my training." "What is that?" Hajin asked gently. "That some truths cannot be spoken, that some things can only be witnessed, not explained. That silence..." She paused, searching for the right words. "That silence can be its own kind of eloquence." Hajin moved closer to the window, gesturing at the stars beyond. "On Earth we have many practices built around silence," he said. "Meditation, where we quiet the mind to hear deeper truths. Moments of silence to honor the dead. The pause before you tell someone you love them. Where the weight of what you are about to say fills the air. My people understand that silence is not empty space waiting to be filled. It is its own presence." "The Coalition has forgotten this," Velrin said. "We fill every moment with words, with debate, with constant communication. We think that is progress, that is civilization. But maybe we have lost something important." She looked at him, her golden amber skin glowing softly in the starlight. "Will you teach me?" she asked. "Will you teach me this human way of being silent?" Hajin met her eyes and smiled. This time he did speak, but his words were few. "Yes." And then they stood together in silence again. But it was different now. It was a shared silence, a mutual understanding. They watched the stars together, and in that watching, in that quiet presence, something began to grow between them. Not just professional respect or diplomatic cooperation. Something deeper. Something that had no name in any language but existed nonetheless in the space between heartbeats. When Velrin finally returned to her quarters, her skin was still that warm golden amber. She lay in the darkness and found that sleep came easily now. Her mind was quiet. Her heart was calm. And in the silence of her own thoughts, she heard something she had been too busy to. The next morning, Velryn woke with a sense of purpose she had not felt in months. She prepared for the day's negotiation differently than before. Instead of reviewing her arguments and counter-arguments, instead of preparing speeches and responses, she simply sat in her quarters and breathed. She practiced being still. It felt strange at first. Her mind wanted to race ahead, planning and worrying, but she kept bringing her attention back to her breath, to the present moment, to the simple act of being alive and aware. It was harder than any debate she had ever prepared for. When she arrived at conference room 7, Hajin was already there. He stood by the window, hands clasped behind his back, looking out at the stars. He did not turn when she entered, but he spoke. He asked how she felt. Velryn admitted she felt different, calmer, but also nervous. She was not sure she knew how to negotiate without relying only on words. Now Hajin turned to face her. His expression was kind, patient. He explained that she was not negotiating without words. She was adding silence to her words. He told her to think of it like music. The notes were important, yes, but the spaces between the notes, the rests, the pauses, these were what gave the notes meaning. Without silence, music was just noise. Velryn considered this. Her people had a strong tradition of music. Thaylen songs were famous throughout the coalition for their complexity and beauty. And yes, the best songs always had moments of silence, moments where the absence of sound made the listener lean forward, waiting, anticipating. So when Cross made his demands, she thought, instead of immediately responding, she should pause. Let silence fill the room. Hajin nodded. But not strategic silence, he clarified, not silence as manipulation, true silence. Silence as presence. Be there, fully there, listening with your whole being. Let them feel what it was like to be truly heard, perhaps for the first time in their lives. Before Velryn could respond, the door chimed. The Krovan had arrived. General Cross entered with the same aggressive energy as before, his two companions flanking him like guards. But this time Velryn did not tense. She did not let her skin shift to defensive colors. Instead, she remained in her calm blue-green, the color of deep ocean peace. Cross greeted her and said he trusted she had reconsidered their very reasonable demands. In the past, Velryn would have immediately corrected him, would have pointed out that his demands were anything but reasonable. Instead, she simply looked at him. She maintained eye contact and said nothing. Cross waited, expecting her usual response. When it did not come, he frowned. He demanded to know if she had reconsidered or not. Still, Velryn said nothing. But her silence was not hostile. She simply looked at him, really looked at him, seeing past his aggressive exterior to something underneath. She saw how his jaw was clenched tight, how his eyes kept darting to his companions, how his massive hands gripped the edge of the table. He was not confident. He was performing confidence, and the performance was exhausting him. The silence stretched. 5 seconds, 10, 20. The smaller Krovan companion shifted uncomfortably. The larger one looked confused. Cross himself seemed to shrink slightly, his aggressive posture faltering. Finally, Velryn spoke. Her voice was calm, measured, with no trace of the defensive anger she usually felt when dealing with Cross. She said she had considered his position carefully. She asked him what the Krovan Empire truly needed from this agreement. Cross blinked, thrown off balance by the simple question. No one had asked him that before. They had argued with his demands, rejected his proposals, countered with their own positions. But no one had asked what his people actually needed, he stammered. His empire was growing. His people needed resources. They needed trade routes. Velryn nodded slowly and then did something that shocked everyone in the room. She said nothing. She simply let his words hang in the air, giving them weight and importance. She showed him that his needs were heard, were valid, were worth considering. For the first time in 2 years of negotiations, General Cross felt like someone was actually listening to him. Not planning their counter-argument while he spoke, not dismissing his words before they were fully spoken, but truly listening. It was an unfamiliar feeling, and it disarmed him completely. The smaller Krovan companion, whose name was Dren, leaned forward slightly. He had always been uncomfortable with his general's aggressive tactics, but speaking against Cross was not done. Now, however, in this new atmosphere of actual listening, he found courage. He asked if he could speak. What they needed was not exclusive rights, he explained. What they needed was reliable access. The difference was important. Cross shot Dren a look, but it was not as harsh as it would have been yesterday. The silence in the room had changed something. It had created space for truth instead of posturing. Velryn turned her attention to Dren, giving him the same quality of listening she had given Cross. Her skin shifted to a warm yellow-green, indicating openness and interest. She asked him to continue. Dren glanced at Cross, who gave a slight nod. Permission granted. Dren explained that their empire had grown rapidly. Too rapidly, perhaps. They had new colonies that needed supplies. They had asked for exclusive rights because they feared that if they did not control the routes, other empires would block them, would use access as a weapon against them. But if they could be assured of reliable passage of fair treatment, they would not need exclusivity. This was the first honest statement any Krovan had made in 2 years, and it had emerged not from aggressive demands or clever arguments, but from silence, from being heard. Velryn looked at Hajin. He had not spoken at all, but his presence in the room was profound. His calm seemed to radiate outward, creating a space where truth could be spoken without fear. She understood now what he had done in the previous meeting. He had not been passive or weak. He had been creating this space, preparing the ground for what was happening now. Reliable access could be guaranteed, Velryn said. The Thaylen government had always valued fair trade. They had never blocked any empire from using their space, provided they respected their sovereignty and followed basic safety protocols. She paused, letting silence fall again. This time, the silence was comfortable. It was a moment for everyone to absorb what had been said, to feel the weight of potential agreement. Cross said they had always refused. They had always denied Krovan requests. Velryn corrected him gently. They had refused exclusive rights. That was different from refusing access. Perhaps they had not been clear about this distinction. Perhaps, she paused, they had both been speaking without truly listening. Cross sat back in his chair, and for the first time he looked tired rather than angry. The constant performance of aggression was exhausting, and he was grateful to let it go. He asked if they would guarantee safe passage for Krovan ships. Yes, Velryn said. With proper documentation and adherence to their safety regulations, any Krovan ship would be welcome in Thaylen space. Dren pulled out a datapad and began making notes. The atmosphere in the room had completely transformed. What had been a battlefield was now a place of actual negotiation. For the next hour, they discussed details. But the discussion was different from before. There were pauses. There were moments of silence where each side considered what the other had said. Velryn found herself using silence like a tool, creating space for thought and reflection. And in those spaces, understanding grew. By the end of the meeting, they had outlined an agreement that satisfied both sides. It was not perfect, but it was real progress, more than had been achieved in 2 years of loud arguments and aggressive demands. As the Krovan prepared to leave, General Cross paused at the door. He looked at Hajin, who had not spoken a single word during the entire meeting. He told the human that he did not understand what he did, but whatever it was, it worked. Hajin simply nodded, a slight smile on his face, and in that silence, in that simple acknowledgement, Cross understood something he had never understood before. Power did not always come from being the loudest voice in the room. Sometimes power came from being the stillest presence. After the Krovan left, Velryn collapsed into her chair, but this time it was from relief rather than frustration. Her skin was a brilliant gold, pure joy. They had done it, she said. They had actually made progress. In one meeting, they had accomplished more than 2 years of negotiations. Hajin moved to sit across from her. His expression was warm, proud. He said she had done it. He had just sat there. Velryn laughed, a sound like musical bells. She looked at him with appreciation and wonder in her violet eyes. He had done so much more than sit, she said. He had taught her something the coalition had forgotten. He had taught her that silence was not the absence of communication. It was a different kind of communication, perhaps the most important kind. They sat together in comfortable silence for a while, both feeling the satisfaction of a job well done. But Velryn's mind was already racing ahead, thinking about implications beyond this single negotiation. She said that what they had discovered, what they had done, could change everything. Not just this negotiation, but all negotiations. The entire way the coalition communicated. Hajin nodded carefully, his expression thoughtful. Yes, he said. But change was not always welcome, even when it was good. There were many news traveled fast through the coalition. Within days, word of the successful Krovan-Thalen negotiations reached every diplomatic station in the galaxy. Ambassadors from dozens of species expressed interest in this new approach. Some praised it as revolutionary. Others dismissed it as a fluke, a one-time success that could not be repeated. But there were those who saw it as something more dangerous, a threat to the established order. Council Speaker Tarn was among the skeptics. As the highest-ranking diplomat in the coalition, he had built his career on the traditional methods of negotiation: verbal debate, logical argument, the constant exchange of ideas through words, the very foundation of the Accord of Voices, the treaty that held the coalition together, was built on the principle that all disputes must be resolved through explicit verbal communication. And now two diplomats, one human and one Thalen, were suggesting that silence could be just as valid as speech. To Tarn, this was not innovation. This was heresy. He called for a formal inquiry. Velrin and Hajin received the summons 3 days after their breakthrough with the Krovan. They were to appear before the full Coalition Council to explain and defend their methods. Velrin's skin shifted through anxious shades of purple and gray when she read the summons. She knew what this meant. The Council was not interested in learning from them. The Council wanted to judge them, to determine if they had violated the fundamental principles of coalition diplomacy. Hajin, as always, remained calm. They sat together in the observation deck, the stars their only witnesses. They will try to make us speak, Velrin said, her voice tight with worry. They will demand that we defend ourselves with words, that we prove silence is valid by not being silent. It is a trap. Hajin nodded slowly. Yes, it is a trap, but perhaps it is also an opportunity. How? Velrin asked, turning to face him. How can it be an opportunity when they have already decided we are wrong? Hajin met her eyes. Because truth does not need to be defended with clever arguments. Truth simply is. If they demand that we prove silence has meaning by speaking, then we show them the limits of their own logic. We show them what they are missing, but what if they do not understand? What if they expel us from the diplomatic corps? What if everything we have worked for is destroyed? Hajin reached for her hand, their fingers intertwining. Then we will have been true to ourselves. And sometimes that is more important than success. The day of the inquiry arrived. The council chamber was immense, designed to accommodate representatives from all 73 coalition species. Tier upon tier of seats rose in a great circle, and at the center stood a small platform where those being questioned would stand. Velrin and Hajin walked to the platform together. The chamber was full. Every seat was occupied. This was not just an inquiry. This was a spectacle. The council wanted everyone to see what happened to those who challenged the traditional ways. Council Speaker Tarn presided from the highest tier. His crystalline features caught the light and scattered it across the chamber like 1,000 tiny stars. He called the session to order. Ambassador Velrin of Thesara, Diplomat Hajin of Earth, you stand accused of violating the spirit of the Accord of Voices. You have conducted negotiations using methods that contradict our fundamental principles. You have suggested that silence, the absence of communication, can be equal to speech. This is a dangerous precedent. What do you say in your defense? Velrin stepped forward. Her skin shifted to a steady blue-green, the color of calm determination. She spoke clearly and without hesitation. We have not suggested that silence is the absence of communication. We have demonstrated that silence is a form of communication. There is a difference. Tarn leaned forward. Explain this difference. When we speak, Velrin said, we fill the air with our ideas, our arguments, our positions. But in our rush to be heard, we often fail to truly listen. We are thinking about our next response instead of understanding what is being said. Silence creates space for genuine listening. It allows meaning to be absorbed, not just heard. Another council member spoke up, a large being with multiple vocal chambers that created a chorus of voices. But the Accord of Voices specifically states that all disputes must be resolved through verbal negotiation. You are undermining our most sacred treaty. We are not undermining it, Velrin replied. We are expanding it. The Accord requires that we communicate. It does not require that every moment be filled with words. Silence, when used properly, communicates respect, consideration, and genuine attention. These are not violations of the Accord. They are its highest expression. The council chamber erupted in debate. Some members nodded in agreement. Others shouted objections. Tarn called for order, and gradually the noise subsided. "You speak well, Ambassador Velrin," Tarn said. "But words are easy. It is your human companion who concerns me." He sat through 2 negotiation sessions without speaking a single word. How can this be defended under any interpretation of our laws? All eyes turned to Hajin. He stood on the platform, calm and still, looking up at the tiers of council members surrounding him. Velrin felt her heart race. This was the moment. This was the test, Diplomat Hajin, Tarn said, his voice hard. "You will speak now. You will defend yourself. You will explain how your silence serves the coalition. You will use words as the Accord demands. Speak." The chamber fell silent. Everyone watched, waiting for Hajin to respond. Seconds ticked by. 10, 20, 30. Still, Hajin said nothing. He simply stood there, his posture relaxed, his expression serene. He looked at each council member in turn, meeting their eyes, acknowledging their presence. But he did not speak. Velrin felt panic rising. What was he doing? This was exactly what Tarn wanted. Proof that Hajin was defying the Accord, that he refused to engage in verbal communication. She wanted to speak for him, to explain, to defend. But she held herself back. She had to trust him. She had to believe he knew what he was doing. Tarn's crystalline features grew sharper, harder. "You refuse to speak? You stand before the highest authority in the coalition, and you refuse to defend yourself?" Still, Hajin said nothing. But now he did something unexpected. He closed his eyes. He took a slow, deep breath, and he smiled. The smile was not mocking or defiant. It was peaceful, accepting. It was the smile of someone who had found truth and did not need to prove it to anyone else. The chamber erupted again, but this time the mood was different. Some council members were angry, calling for immediate expulsion, but others were quieter, thoughtful. A few had closed their own eyes as if trying to understand what Hajin was experiencing. And then Velrin understood. This was not defiance. This was teaching. Hajin was showing them, not telling them. He was demonstrating that silence was not emptiness or refusal. It was presence. It was peace. It was a different kind of answer. She stepped forward and stood beside Hajin. She said nothing. She simply took his hand and closed her own eyes. Her skin shifted to that warm golden amber, the color of deep contentment. The chamber fell silent again, but this time the silence was different. It was not the silence of waiting for someone to speak. It was the silence of consideration, of reflection, of beings who were being forced to confront something they had never truly considered before. One by one, a few council members closed their eyes. Then a few more. Not all of them, not even most, but enough to show that something was changing, that Hajin's silence was speaking louder than any speech he could have given. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Tarn spoke. His voice was different now, quieter, less certain. "This inquiry is concluded for today. We will reconvene in 3 days. The council needs time to consider what we have witnessed." As the chamber emptied, Velrin and Hajin remained on the platform, still holding hands. When they finally opened their eyes and looked at each other, no words were needed. They had taken the greatest risk of their careers. They had stood before the coalition and refused to play by the established rules, and somehow, impossibly, they had not been destroyed. They had planted a seed. Whether it would grow or wither, only time would tell. But for now, in this moment, they had each other. And they had the truth, and sometimes that was enough. The decision came 3 days later. The council voted to suspend both Velrin and Hajin from active diplomatic duties pending further review. It was not expulsion, but it was close. They were to return to their homeworlds and await the council's final judgment. For Velrin, this felt like death. Diplomacy was not just her career. It was her identity. To be sent back to Thesara in disgrace, to face her people as a failure, was almost unbearable. Her skin remained a dull gray for days, the Thylan color of deep sorrow. Hajin tried to comfort her, but words seemed inadequate. Instead, they sat together in silence, hour after hour, as the Harmony's crown prepared to take them to their respective homeworlds. The silence between them was no longer peaceful. It was heavy with loss. On their last night together before separation, they met in the observation deck one final time. The stars looked different now. Less beautiful, less hopeful. "I am sorry," Velrin said, her voice breaking. "I asked you to stay with me. I asked you to teach me. And now both of our careers are destroyed." Hajin shook his head gently. "We chose this path together. We chose truth over safety. I have no regrets, but what happens now?" Velrin asked. "We will be separated by light years. Who knows if the Council will even allow us to communicate? Then we will communicate the way we know best," Hajin said softly, in silence, and so they created a ritual. Every day at the same hour, they would open a quantum comm channel. No words would be exchanged, no images, just an open connection, silent and pure. Each would know the other was there, present, breathing, alive. It was a thread connecting them across the void. Velrin was sent back to Thesara. The ocean world welcomed her home, but there was no celebration. Her family was kind but confused. They did not understand why she had risked everything for such a strange idea. The Thalen people valued tradition, and Velrin had broken with tradition in the most public way possible. Hajin returned to Earth. He was reassigned to a research outpost in the Australian outback, far from any major cities or spaceports. It was meant to be a punishment, isolation from the corridors of power, but Hajin did not experience it that way. The desert was quiet, peaceful. He had time to think, to meditate, to simply be. Every day at the appointed hour, they opened their comm channel. No words, just presence. Velrin would sit in her room overlooking the Thessaran seas, and Hajin would sit under the vast Australian sky, and they would breathe together across impossible distances. Meanwhile, the Coalition faced its own crisis. The Outer Rim Confederacy, a group of 5 species that had broken away from the main coalition 30 years earlier, had amassed a military fleet on the border. Tensions had been building for decades, but now they had reached a breaking point. The Confederacy had grievances. They felt ignored by the coalition, treated as second-class members when they had been part of it. They felt their voices had never been truly heard, and now they were done talking. War seemed inevitable. The coalition's greatest diplomats were sent to negotiate. Ambassadors with decades of experience, masters of verbal debate and logical argument. They met with Confederacy leaders for weeks. They talked and talked and talked, nothing changed. The Confederacy had heard enough words. They were tired of promises and explanations and justifications. They wanted action or they wanted war. The talking had become just noise. Council Speaker Tarn watched in growing desperation as negotiation after negotiation failed. The military was preparing for conflict. Ships were being positioned. Evacuation plans were being made for border worlds. The coalition had not seen war in over a century, and now it seemed unstoppable. In a private meeting with his closest advisors, Tarn admitted something he had never thought he would say. The traditional methods were not working. The Confederacy had stopped listening. They needed a different approach. One of his advisors, a wise old being from a long-lived species, spoke carefully. There were 2 diplomats who recently demonstrated a different approach. Perhaps it is time to reconsider their methods. Tarn resisted at first. His pride would not allow him to admit that he had been wrong. But as the crisis deepened, as war drew closer with each passing day, he realized that pride was a luxury the coalition could not afford. He sent private messages to both Velrin and Hajin. The messages were brief and formal, but their meaning was clear. The coalition needed them. Would they return and attempt what no one else had been able to accomplish? Velrin received the message in the middle of her daily silent communion with Hajin. Her skin flashed through a dozen colors in rapid succession, shock and hope and fear all mixing together. She broke protocol and spoke into the comm channel for the first time in weeks. "Hajin, did you receive a message from Tarn?" "Yes," came his voice, familiar and warm despite the vast distance. "I did. What do we do?" There was a pause. Not the comfortable silence they had cultivated, but a thoughtful pause. When Hajin spoke again, his voice was steady. "We go. Not because they have finally recognized we were right, but because people will die if we do not try. Because peace is more important than pride. What if we fail?" Velrin asked. "What if our methods do not work with the Confederacy? What if we make things worse? Then at least we will have tried. And we will face whatever comes together. Are you willing to risk everything one more time?" Velrin looked out at the Thessaran Ocean, at the waves rolling endlessly toward the shore. Each wave was different, but all were connected to the same vast sea. She and Hajin were like that. Different beings from different worlds, but connected by something deeper than any distance could sever. "Yes," she said, "I am ready. Let us go save the galaxy." 2 days later, they met at a neutral station between Coalition and Confederacy space. When Velrin saw Hajin walking toward her across the docking bay, her skin erupted in brilliant gold. She ran to him, and they embraced, holding each other as if they had been separated for years instead of weeks. No words were needed. Their reunion said everything. Tarn met them in a private conference room. He looked older than Velrin remembered. The weight of potential war had aged him. He stood when they entered, and for a long moment he simply looked at them. Then he did something unexpected. He bowed. It was a gesture of respect, of acknowledgement. "Of apology, I was wrong," he said simply. "I allowed tradition to blind me to truth. I allowed pride to cloud my judgment. The Coalition is on the brink of war because our diplomats, myself included, have forgotten how to truly listen. We fill every moment with words, but we hear nothing. You tried to teach us this, and I rejected you. I am sorry." Velrin's skin shifted to a soft, forgiving blue. She bowed in return. "We understand. Change is difficult, especially when it challenges everything we believe." Tarn nodded. "The Confederacy leaders have agreed to one final negotiation. They have been told that you will be conducting it. They are curious, I think. They have heard rumors of your unusual methods. This is your chance, and perhaps the Coalition's last chance." Hajin spoke for the first time. "What is it that the Confederacy truly wants? Not their stated demands, but what they actually need." Tarn considered this. I think they want to be heard. Not just their words, but their pain, their feeling of being dismissed and ignored for decades. They want someone to acknowledge that their grievances are real, not just debate whether their grievances are valid." Hajin nodded slowly. "Then we will listen, not to argue, not to counter, not to fix, just to listen, fully and completely. Is that enough?" Tarn asked. "Can listening alone prevent a war?" Hajin and Velrin looked at each other. In that glance, they shared the same thought. They did not know if it would be enough. They only knew they had to try. "We will find out," Velrin said. "When do we meet with them?" "Tomorrow," Tarn replied. "The fate of the Coalition rests in your hands. May the stars guide you." That night, Velrin and Hajin did not sleep. They sat together in Velrin's quarters, preparing for the most important negotiation of their lives. But their preparation was not reviewing files or planning arguments. It was simply being present with each other, building the calm and centered energy they would need. Hajin taught Velrin an ancient earth meditation practice. They sat facing each other, eyes closed, breathing in rhythm. With each breath, they released fear and doubt. With each exhalation, they created space for whatever would come. When dawn came to the station, they were ready, not because they had a perfect strategy or clever arguments, but because they had each other, and they had the truth that silence sometimes speaks louder than any words. The fate of the galaxy would be decided not in grand speeches or logical debates, but in the spaces between breaths, in the quiet moments where understanding can grow, in the simple act of being fully present with those who need to be heard. The Confederacy delegation arrived at the neutral station with an air of barely contained hostility. Their ships bristled with weapons, a clear reminder that they had come prepared for war, not peace. The leader of the delegation was Ambassador Nira, a fierce being from a warrior culture that valued strength and directness above all else. Nira entered the negotiation room with her military escort. Her posture aggressive, her expression skeptical. She had heard about the unusual human Thaylan diplomatic team, and she was not impressed. Words were words. She had heard thousands of promises from Coalition diplomats over the years. None had meant anything. The room was arranged differently than standard Coalition negotiations. Instead of a formal conference table with opposing sides, there was a circle of comfortable chairs. Soft lighting, no display showing data or demands. Just space and silence. Nira stopped in the doorway, immediately suspicious. Where were the tables? Where were the documents? Where were the other Coalition negotiators? There was only this human and this Thaylan sitting calmly in chairs waiting. Velrin stood when Nira entered. Her skin was a calm, welcoming blue-green. She gestured to an empty chair. "Welcome, Ambassador Nira. Thank you for coming. Please sit with us." Nira did not move. This is not how negotiations are conducted. Where is Speaker Tarn? Where are the coalition representatives? Are you trying to insult us by sending only 2 low-level diplomats? Hajin spoke, his voice quiet but clear. Speaker Tarn thought perhaps the problem was too many voices, too many people trying to talk at once. He asked us to create space for a different kind of conversation. I did not come here for conversation, Nira said sharply. I came here for answers. For action. The Confederacy has been ignored for 30 years. We are done being patient. Velrin nodded slowly. I understand. You feel unheard. You feel dismissed. Your pain is real and it deserves acknowledgement. Nira blinked, thrown off balance. No coalition diplomat had ever acknowledged Confederacy pain before. They had always defended coalition actions, explained why the Confederacy was wrong, justified the status quo. But this Thalen had just agreed. You are right, Velrin continued. The coalition has failed you. That is a truth that needs to be spoken and heard. Will you sit with us and help us understand? Something in Nira's expression shifted. She was still suspicious, still ready for verbal combat. But curiosity was beginning to creep in. She dismissed her military escort and slowly sat in one of the chairs, keeping her posture rigid and defensive. Tell us what happened, Hajin said simply. Not your official grievances. Not your formal demands. Just what happened to you, to your people, that brought us to this moment. Nira stared at him. This had to be a trick. Diplomats did not ask personal questions. They dealt with policies and treaties and formal positions. But both the human and the Thalen were looking at her with such genuine attention that she found herself responding. 30 years ago, she began slowly. My species joined the coalition. We were promised equal partnership. We were promised that our voice would matter. But every time we proposed something, every time we raised concerns, we were told to wait, to be patient, to understand that the coalition had established procedures. She paused and Velrin said nothing, did not interrupt, did not explain. Just listened. My mother was a diplomat, Nira continued, her voice growing stronger. She spent 20 years trying to get the coalition to address our needs. 20 years of meetings where she spoke and no one really listened. 20 years of feeling invisible. She died believing she had failed our people. Nira's voice broke slightly on the last words. She had not meant to reveal so much, had not meant to make this personal. But the silence in the room was different from any silence she had experienced. It was not the silence of people waiting to speak. It was the silence of people holding space for her pain. I am sorry, Velrin said quietly. Your mother deserved better. You deserved better. And then Velrin did something remarkable. She let silence fall. She did not rush to propose solutions or make promises. She simply sat with Nira in the reality of that pain, acknowledging it, giving it weight. The silence stretched. At first, Nira wanted to fill it, to return to anger and demands. But something kept her quiet. For the first time in her diplomatic career, she felt like someone was actually present with her grief, not trying to fix it or explain it away. Hajin leaned forward slightly. What would it look like for the Confederacy to feel heard? Not just now in this moment, but going forward? Nira considered the question. It was not what she expected. She had prepared arguments about resources and territory and political representation, but this question went deeper. We would need a seat on the council, she said slowly. A real seat with real voting power, not observer status, not advisory roles. Actual power to shape coalition policy. Hajin nodded. What else? A formal apology. Not just to the Confederacy as a political entity, but to the species who left. To my mother and the other diplomats who were ignored for decades. An acknowledgement that the coalition failed them. Velrin's skin shifted to a soft, serious purple. That is reasonable. What else do you need? Nira found herself speaking more freely now. Economic support for Confederacy worlds that were left behind when we separated. Educational exchanges. Cultural programs. All the things we were promised but never received. And as she spoke, Velrin and Hajin listened. Truly listened. They did not argue about feasibility or cost. They did not explain why these things had not happened before. They simply heard her, took her needs seriously, treated them as valid. The meeting lasted 4 hours. But it was unlike any negotiation Nira had ever experienced. There were long periods of silence. There were moments where they simply sat together, absorbing the weight of what had been said. There were no raised voices, No aggressive demands, no defensive explanations. At the end of the session, Nira stood to leave. She paused at the door and looked back at Velrin and Hajin. "What you do," she said slowly, "this silence thing, it is strange. But it works. For the first time in 30 years. I feel like someone from the coalition actually heard me. Not just my words." Velrin smiled, her skin glowing with warm gold. "Thank you for sharing your truth with us. Tomorrow we will meet again and talk about how to move forward. But today was about listening. And you honored us by letting us listen." After Nira left, Velrin and Hajin sat in the quiet room for a long time. They were exhausted. Truly listening, giving someone your complete attention for hours, was harder than any verbal debate. "Do you think it will be enough?" Velrin asked. "Can listening alone prevent this war?" Hajin reached for her hand. "I do not know. But we gave her something she has not had in decades. We gave her space to be heard. That changes everything." Over the next week, they met with Nira and other Confederacy leaders every day. Each session followed the same pattern. Less talking, more listening, more silence, more presence. Gradually, the Confederacy leaders began to soften. They began to speak not just about demands, but about fears and hopes. About what they needed not just politically, but emotionally. About wounds that had never been acknowledged, let alone healed. And in those silences, in those spaces of genuine listening, trust began to grow. Not overnight, not easily, but steadily, like a plant pushing through soil toward light. Coalition representatives joined the sessions, but under strict instructions from Tarn. They were to listen more than speak. They were to acknowledge Confederacy pain before defending coalition actions. They were to create space, not fill it. It was uncomfortable for diplomats trained in constant verbal engagement, but they saw that it worked. They saw hostility transform into openness. They saw rigid positions become flexible possibilities. Finally, after 2 weeks of these unusual negotiations, they drafted an agreement. The Treaty of Silent Understanding, they called it. It gave the Confederacy real representation in coalition government. It provided economic support and cultural programs, and, crucially, it included a formal apology from the coalition to all species and individuals who had been made to feel invisible. The signing ceremony was unlike any treaty signing in coalition history. There were speeches, yes, but they were brief. The real ceremony was a full minute of silence observed by all parties. A minute where everyone in the room simply sat with the weight of what they were creating. A minute to honor all the voices that had not been heard, all the pain that had been ignored, all the possibilities that had been lost to endless talking without listening. When the minute ended, Nira signed the treaty. Her hand shook slightly as she made her mark. When she looked up, there were tears in her eyes. "My mother would have been proud," she said quietly. Not of the treaty itself, but of this moment. Of finally being heard. Velrin stood and embraced her, breaking all diplomatic protocol. And Nira, this fierce warrior from a culture that valued strength, embraced her back. The war that had seemed inevitable was prevented, not through clever arguments or military threats, but through the simple act of creating space for pain to be acknowledged, for voices to be truly heard, for silence to carry the weight of genuine understanding. And the coalition learned a lesson it would not soon forget. That sometimes the most powerful thing a diplomat can do is not to speak, but to listen. Not to fill every moment with words, but to create space for truth to emerge. Not to have all the answers, but to sit with the questions, giving the 5 years past. The Treaty of Silent Understanding became the most enduring peace agreement in coalition history. Not because it had clever legal language or complex enforcement mechanisms, but because it was built on genuine understanding rather than forced compromise. The coalition changed. The Accord of Voices was amended to officially recognize silence as a valid form of communication. Diplomatic training programs across the galaxy added courses on presence and listening. Human instructors, once seen as strange for their quiet ways, became sought-after teachers. Council Speaker Tarn, to his credit, became one of the strongest advocates for these changes. He taught young diplomats about his own journey from skepticism to understanding. He spoke openly about how pride and tradition had nearly led the coalition to war, and how 2 diplomats who dared to be different had saved them all. But the most profound changes happened at the personal level, Velrin. and Hajin left the diplomatic service a year. After the treaty was signed, they had accomplished what they set out to do. They had shown the galaxy that silence had value. Now they wanted to dedicate themselves to teaching others. They founded the Institute of Silent Understanding on a small moon near Earth. The location was perfect, quiet and peaceful, with wide windows looking out at the stars. Beings from all over the coalition came to study there. The Institute did not teach traditional negotiation tactics. It taught presence. It taught listening. It taught the art of creating space for truth to emerge. Students learned meditation practices from Earth. They learned contemplative traditions from dozens of worlds. They learned how to be comfortable in silence, how to trust that not every moment needs to be filled with words. Nira, the former Confederacy ambassador, became one of their most dedicated students. She brought other warriors from her culture, beings who had spent their lives solving problems with force, and she watched as they discovered a different kind of strength, the strength of stillness, the power of truly hearing another being. One evening, as the sun set over the Institute, painting the sky in brilliant colors, Velrin and Hajin sat together in their favorite spot. A simple bench overlooking a garden they had planted together. The garden had plants from dozens of worlds all growing together in beautiful diversity. Hajin reached for Velrin's hand. They sat in comfortable silence watching the light fade. 5 years of partnership, of love, of building something meaningful together, and they had never needed many words to understand each other. "Do you remember the first night we met?" Velrin asked eventually. "In the observation deck?" Hajin smiled. "How could I forget? You asked me a question that changed everything." Velrin's skin shifted through shades of amber and gold, the colors of happiness and nostalgia. "I was so confused by your silence. I thought you were being rude or dismissive. I had no idea you were showing me the most profound respect possible." "You taught me something too," Hajin said. "You taught me that silence is not just a human gift. It is something any being can learn if they are willing to let go of their need to constantly perform and prove and explain." They sat quietly for a while longer. Students passed by on the paths below, some walking in meditation, others sitting in small groups practicing mindful conversation. The Institute had become a sanctuary, a place where beings could slow down and remember how to truly connect. "We should get married," Velrin said suddenly. Hajin turned to look at her, surprised. "We have been partners for 5 years. We run an institute together. We share our lives completely. What would marriage change?" Velrin's skin shimmered with warm light. "Nothing, everything. It would be a ceremony, a public acknowledgement of what we already know, and I want to do it in our way." Mostly in silence, Hajin laughed, a sound full of joy. "Then let us do it. A ceremony that honors both our traditions and transcends them both." The wedding took place 3 months later in the Institute's main hall. Representatives from across the coalition attended, including Speaker Tarn, Ambassador Nira, and even General Cross of the Krovan Empire. The ceremony was designed by Velrin and Hajin together. It began with an hour of shared silence, all the guests sitting together in quiet contemplation. No music, no words, just presence, just the sound of breathing and the awareness of being together. Then Velrin spoke the traditional Thalen binding words, a brief verse about 2 currents joining in one great ocean. Her voice was clear and musical, and her skin glowed with brilliant gold. Hajin spoke next, reciting traditional Earth wedding vows, words about love and partnership and facing life together. His voice was steady and warm, full of certainty, and then they returned to silence. They stood facing each other, hands joined, simply looking into each other's eyes. They stood that way for a full 5 minutes, communicating more in that silence than any additional words could have conveyed. When they finally turned to face their guests, there was not a dry eye in the hall. Beings from species that had never cried at weddings found themselves moved beyond words. They had witnessed something profound. Not just the joining of 2 lives, but a demonstration of a different way to be together, a way that honored words but understood their limits, a way that embraced silence not as emptiness but as fullness. The celebration afterward was joyful but true to their philosophy. There were moments of music and laughter, yes, but also moments of quiet reflection, spaces where guests could simply be present with each other without the pressure to entertain or perform. Years continued to pass. The Institute grew. More branches opened on other worlds. The philosophy of silent understanding spread throughout the coalition and beyond. Wars were prevented. Old conflicts were resolved. New forms of communication emerged that combined the best of speech and silence. Velrin and Hajin aged together. Velrin's skin took on the silver-blue tones that Thalen showed in their later years. Hajin's hair turned gray, then white. But their connection only deepened. They developed a morning ritual. Every day at dawn, they would sit together in the garden and share tea in perfect silence. Sometimes the silence lasted 5 minutes, sometimes an hour. It did not matter. It was their time to simply be together, without agenda or purpose. Just two beings who had found in each other what they had not known they were seeking. One morning, many years after they founded the Institute, a young student approached them nervously. She was from a species that valued verbal eloquence above all else, and she was struggling with the Institute's methods. "Masters," she said, addressing them formally, "I have a question. How do I know if I am doing it right? When I sit in silence, sometimes I feel peaceful, but sometimes my mind is full of noise and worry. How do I know if I am truly learning silence?" Velrin and Hajin looked at each other, a glance full of understanding. Then Velrin turned to the student. "Tell me," she said gently, "before you came to the Institute, when your mind was full of noise and worry, what did you do?" "I would talk about it," the student said. "I would find someone and tell them all my problems. I would fill the air with words until I felt better." "And did you feel better?" "Sometimes. For a little while. But the noise always came back." Velrin nodded. "Now when you sit in silence, you are learning to notice the noise instead of adding to it. You are learning to observe your thoughts instead of being controlled by them. This is not about achieving perfect quiet in your mind. This is about being present with whatever is there." Hajin added, "The silence we teach is not about having no thoughts. It is about not needing to turn every thought into words. It is about being comfortable with your own mind even when it is busy." The student's expression cleared. "So I do not have to be perfect at being silent?" "No one is perfect at being silent," Velrin said with a smile. "Even after all these years, my mind still sometimes races. But I have learned to let it race without chasing it. That is the practice. That is the gift." The student bowed and thanked them, walking away with new understanding. When she was gone, Hajin turned to Velrin. "Do you remember when you asked me if I thought you were beautiful?" Velrin's skin shimmered with amber light. "How could I forget? That was the moment everything changed." "I have thought about that moment many times over the years," Hajin said, "about why I did not answer with words. I could say now that I was teaching you about silence, showing you its power. But the truth is simpler. What is it? The truth is that you took my breath away. Your beauty was so overwhelming in that moment that words felt inadequate. Silence was not a choice. It was the only response that honored what I felt." Velrin moved closer to him, taking his weathered hands in her own. "And I thought you were being rude. I thought you were refusing to answer. But then you understood." "Yes. I understood that silence is an answer. That sometimes it is the only answer. That the deepest truths cannot be spoken, only witnessed." They sat together as the sun rose higher, warming the garden. Students moved about their day, practicing presence, learning to listen, discovering the power of spaces between words. In the distance, a young human woman was teaching a class of mixed species about meditation. A Krovan warrior was sitting in a circle with former enemies, breathing together in silence. A Thalen elder was writing poetry about the sound of silence. And somewhere in the galaxy, diplomats were preventing another conflict by simply listening.